My name is Jake Monroe. I'm the soil fertility specialist for field crops with Omafra, and I'm really excited to talk to you guys about a project that we've just started this past fall, and it's going to be going for the next 2 years, looking at improving cereal rye cover crop management before soybeans, and we're going to be kind of looking at two different components of the project. Okay, so just broadly, the project objectives are first, to find out how to minimize the risks to yield and learn about weed impacts in plant green situations, soybeans being seeded into cereal rye. And the second kind of complementary but really separate component of the project is to look at comparing cover crop-based no-till to tillage-based organic soybean production. I know we've got a small number of organic producers here, but those of you who know how organic soybean production works, you know you're trying to fight against weeds and using tillage as your tool to get those weeds killed and allow that soybean crop to canopy. So pretty intensive from a tillage standpoint, and we know that there's another way to do it from work that's been done in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, neighboring jurisdictions, New York State, where you can use cereal rye as a mulch that you plant into and eliminate the need for tillage in an organic soybean system. We've got quite a few cover croppers here, and cereal rye has been around a long time, probably one of the original cover crops. We all know it's probably the hardiest of all cover crop options. I've put early November there. Depending on where you are in the province, you could, in many seasons, probably seed a little later than early November and still get a cover crop come spring. Makes it really the only, reliable option after grain corn. In a decent year, you can get that seeded after grain corn. Of course, it grows rapidly in the spring, before many of our other winter cereals. Erosion, erosion prevention, erosion reduction, that's really the original reason and motivation behind cereal rye as a cover crop. I'll show you some of the other reasons why we might consider it, but it does that job very well. Relatively inexpensive, and in comparison to annual ryegrass, again, completely different cover crops, different species, cereal rye is quite easy to kill. Not so much the case for annual ryegrass. Helps to build organic matter soil structure, fibrous root system, really aids in that. And the point here that I'm going to highlight throughout is that we're seeing from some early research from Clarence Swanton and Mike Cobra and others that kind of re-looking at rye as an option to manage some of our herbicide-resistant weeds, and have seen some encouraging early work that's shown that rye can have some weed suppressive effects. Here's just a visual to kind of drive home the point of how effective rye can be at minimizing erosion. So in this case, this is a photo from Upper Thames River Conservation Authority. They had a plot on fairly sloping ground where they seeded strips of rye, and they left some strips relatively bare. And for those of you who recall the wet April that we had in 2017, this was a particularly wet day on the 20th where a 1/4 inch fell in 10 minutes. And you can see how we've got some little rills forming already on this steeply sloping field, and you can see that the benefit that rye cover crop is having. Not super thick, but it's helping to slow that movement of water and keep soil in place. Okay, so that's a little bit of background on rye, and I'm really going to now kind of get into some of the work that's already been done and some of the motivation for this trial, because I don't have results to share yet. We'll have those in the next 2 years, but I will show you some data. I'll show you some work that's been done in Brant County specifically, where we've already started looking at this question. So here's an average of 4 site years, 1 from 2017, 3 from 2018, and just showing the increase in biomass that you get by delaying termination of rye. So here at early termination, on average, that was May 10th. We had just under 500 pounds of dry matter. That would look like a relatively thin and short stand of rye. You leave it an extra 2 weeks, later planted soybeans in this case, but you leave it an extra 2 weeks until May 24th, and you've increased the amount of biomass there by over 4 times. So it really, we start seeing that steep acceleration of growth and biomass really in the month of May. And so the question is, do we get some soil benefits from that? And also, can we do that in a way that limits the risk to the following crop? So I mentioned weed control benefits. Here's a shot from Norfolk County from Mike Cobra, just showing the benefit of actually a fairly thin stand of rye here, but that to the line is showing the impact that rye can have in terms of suppressing Canada fleabane and other weeds. In this case, it's a no-till situation, and that's fleabane on the right-hand side. You can't quite see it in this photo, but in other shots that Mike has, you can see there's actually a gap between where the rye is and where the fleabane starts growing, and that's kind of more than can be explained by just shading and competition. So there's a graduate student looking right now at the University of Guelph into allelopathy and the impact of allelopathic chemicals on helping to suppress fleabane. So I think this is a really kind of key part of this project is investigating that further, those weed impacts. And of course, by leaving that rye to grow longer, we create a mulch, and that mulch, can be pretty persistent. So at one of our sites in Brant County, just north of Brantford, you can see on October 25th, on what would otherwise be a pretty bare soil, there's still residue that's left over, and we can see that their earthworm middens are being built, and that rye is helping to feed soil life. Okay, so what's the impact of planting green, or what do we know so far? So this is going to be, half of this Tier 2 project is looking at answering this question. We've got a little bit of information already, and so this is a shot from one of our trials at that same site just north of Brantford. And this is what we know in terms of plant stand, soybean population and plant stand. In some cases, especially when we've got lower seeding rates, planting green into a fairly thick cover crop can hurt our soybean stand. So in 2 cases here, we were down below 90,000 plants per acre. Not ideal, not a replant situation by any means, but not ideal, and kind of keep that in mind as I show you some more of the data. So the second thing that we know about planting soybeans into a standing, planting them green into a standing rye cover crop is that you are going to get delayed early season growth and delayed maturity, and that's directly proportional to how thick the rye is that you're seeding into. So we really haven't seen much difference at all if you've got a very thin stand of rye. But as you start getting into the thicker stands, that's the kind of difference you might see that we saw at this site in late June. And here's a site that we had in Lambton County, and that was on the left-hand side, that was planted green, and on the right, early terminated rye. So about one growth stage behind throughout the season is typically what we saw this past year. Longer to start, nodulating and producing its own nitrogen. However, at the end of the year, the height difference was made up, and actually at this site in Brantford, we did pod counts and saw that the pods were there, and that the delay in early season growth was made up, kind of accounted for by the end of the season. So soybeans are fairly resilient that way, and that's why we're doing this project on soybeans, not on corn. Okay, so the impact on yield. Again, these same sites, and if you remember, these were the 2 sites that had the reduced stand below 90,000. And so adding up our 4 site years, the 1 in 2017 and the 3 from this year, basically we ended up with a slight decrease in yield for planting green into that rye cover crop, 1.5 bushels over these 4 sites. All those A's tell us that there was no statistical difference at any site, but certainly, we certainly saw a little bit of a trend, I think, this year that at a couple of the sites, in particular the Lambton site here, there was a reduction in yield. Statistically significant or not, there's a trend there. So that's something we need to look at a little bit more. And I think one of the big factors there was those lower seeding rates at 140,000 and getting that stand that was lower than 90, I think is a big factor when we're planting into a relatively thick cover crop. Okay, so that's a little bit of the background on kind of the first component of the project, and I'm going to come back to how we're going to evaluate it in this project. But I wanted to give a little bit of background now on the second component, which is this system of basically no-tilling soybeans into a rye mulch and growing soybeans organically without tillage, which I think is, we talked about innovation, or Kevin Stewart talked about innovation earlier. I think this is a really innovative practice, and I think it's an exciting thing to be evaluating in Ontario. So the question is, is this possible in Ontario? Sure, they've done it in Pennsylvania, they've done it in New York State. We're at a higher latitude, or a little bit cooler, different climate. Can we do it here? And that's really what the project's all about. But I will show you an example of a grower who has been making this system work near St. Mary's. So we'll look at how that's been working out for him. But for those of you who aren't familiar with how the system works, basically it's a matter of seeding rye early enough in the fall, getting it established, treating it more or less like a crop, really treating it, getting it established well, and then in the spring when it's flowering, rolling it with a roller crimper to lay it down flat, crimp it, and kill it, planting into that mulch. That mulch should be very, very thick, and then basically leaving the field until harvest. And so just a couple more notes on how this system really has been shown through lots of research and on-farm experience. The rye has to be seeded early, at least in our part of the country. Needs to be before the beginning of October. So we've got all of our plots seeded this year, and it ranged from middle of September to end of September, but we got all of our rye seeded before October, which turned out this year to be a really good thing. So we had a thick seeding rate. You need to have a relatively thick seeding rate for this to work. We're aiming to get lots of competition in the early season with weeds, and then we're looking to get a thick mulch established. So over 100 pounds per acre is a bare minimum, and in this project we've kind of been on the conservative side, so we've got 3 bushels per acre, about 170 pounds of a seeding rate for rye. Roller crimper, as I mentioned, it's used full flower of the rye, so also known as anthesis. You can see that flowering there. Maybe that was a little early in that case, but you can get a good kill if you go at full flower, and that's when that plant's vulnerable to being crimped, laid down, and not coming back up. So we're looking at typically late May to early June. Okay, so here's our grower example. These are slides I borrowed from Maurice van de Waal, who's an organic grain farmer near St. Mary's. This was a shot of his planter planting into the rye mulch this past season. This was on June 1st, thereabouts, very early June. And this is just some of his notes on his planter setup. So straight coulter in front to cut through the mulch. And this is going to be a different planter setup than most organic guys are running, because they're going typically into a clean till situation. This would be more like a no-till, planting into no-till plus conditions. So 250 pounds of down pressure per unit, and then I've got a little kind of blown up photo there. He's got a cast iron spike tooth closing wheel on one side and just a regular cast iron closing wheel on the other side, and he's found that works quite well for him. And actually, a lot of the research out of the States so far has found that that's a pretty good setup for closing wheels to make sure you get that slot closed. So it's all about, in this system, it's all about getting that seed in the ground, at a consistent depth, but not disturbing that mulch too much. So this is basically what it should look like. And so you can't see any soil, and if you are seeing soil, that's just a spot where the weeds are going to be able to grow up. It needs to be a thick and complete mulch over the soil. As you can imagine, this creates a pretty challenging environment for the soybeans to grow up out of, but it's also very challenging for weeds. So that's kind of the key to making it successful. Here's just a shot from that same field. This is from Maurice's field this past June. He was getting good seeding depth, cutting through that rye quite nicely with his planter setup. Had no trouble getting deep enough, and was planting into moisture. The one, One of the areas where this system can fall down and where adaptive management is needed is if we have very, very dry spring conditions. That rye will, as we all know, suck moisture, and if you have extremely dry conditions, you need to be adaptive and think about ways that you could potentially harvest that rye for forage or move to a plan B. But in most springs, and in particular in wet springs, the experience, at least in the States, has been that this is a pretty good system if you've got excessive moisture. Okay, so here's what that field looked like in mid-July. The soybeans are very, very slow to get going in this system. In this particular case, Morris is set up with RTK, so planted 30-inch rows and then doubled back and had 15-inch row spacing. Had a little bit of compromised stand in some of the wheel tracks. Ended up with the stand somewhere around 90,000. So higher seeding rates are better. Probably he's going to be moving to higher seeding rates, and we will kind of target those higher seeding rates in the project as well. Again, you want to have especially if your soybeans are that slow to start, you want to have more of a population there. And another issue that can come up in this case, at Morris's field, not throughout the whole field, but you can have some bounce back, especially if you go out a little on the early side for the crimping. And so that's in this case not something that was a huge issue, but if you're getting too much bouncing back to the competition, could be a bit too much for the soybeans. But that was fairly light. 1 month later, and this is what the field looked like. So it doesn't look so bad anymore. It's completely canopied. I was out in the field doing pod counts, and their beans were well potted up and developing nicely. Certainly, these are some of the better shots from the field. There were some weed escapes for sure, but no worse certainly than a typical organic soybean field where there's going to be weed escapes. So that's what that field looked like in August. And here, just to sum it up here, this is what's possible in Ontario, and this is, I think, why this project is quite exciting, is because we've already had an innovative grower show that it is possible. Here's the yield number from that field. Now, it's a little on the high side. He said his monitor wasn't completely calibrated, but he was over 60 bushels per acre, which was very, very respectable for his neck of the woods. For organic soybeans with this system. But moving on to the project, this is the kind of the basics of how our first question is going to be answered. We're going to be looking at that termination timing question, and of course we'll have a control, and we're going to have an early termination and a late termination. So similar to the plots I showed before, and we're going to be looking at rye biomass. That's a number that we always want. We want to know what's happening with our soybean stands. Are we still seeing that reduction in soybean stand? Do we need to have a certain seeding rate that we recommend in this kind of situation? A big part of it, of course, is going to be looking at weeds and soybean staging and ultimately yield. So that's that first component of the project, termination timing. And then I don't have a diagram for it, but with the organic no-till, we're going to be comparing the grower's typical practice, tillage-based practice, side by side with the full roller crimper no-till soybean system. And so there's going to be a fair bit to that, but we'll be adjusting and comparing systems. So seeding rates may differ, seeding date may differ for the soybeans, but we really want to put those two systems head to head and do them both properly. Just a quick list of the cooperators in a sense of kind of the spread that we have, and I think we've got about at least half, maybe 2/3 of our cooperators here today, and that's just a breakdown of the part of the project we're going to be doing at each site. So we've got a relatively even breakdown of the two components of the project, and here's a little just for the Heartland region, a breakdown of where each field is located. So we've got a nice little spread across mainly Wellington and Huron counties. Okay, so as I already mentioned, the current status is all of the rye, fortunately, has been seeded. Shot from the Israel's farm here, and this is from the Elora Research Station. I've gone out just to do some confirmation to make sure the soil type is what it says it is on ag maps, because that's not always 100% right. And we're basically getting ready. We're pretty well all ready for the spring when it does come. One little issue so far, you can see that gap there. This is at a site in Wellington County near Erin. This is one of the organic plots, and I was mentioning how important it is to have a thick mulch. That kind of gap might be a real issue in terms of weeds coming up through there. So to be determined how we'll deal with that from a research standpoint. I'm open to suggestions if you have any. And then another challenge, of course, is going to be looking at planter modification again in that organic no-till system, where we've got planters with our cooperators set up for a typical clean till situation, and as I mentioned, there's some modifications that probably would be quite helpful, and we do have some money in the budget for that. And just wrapping up, so just a few notes on what we've done for communication. We've had some information in the Heartland newsletter. We've talked about it at Wellington and Brant Soil and Crops. We've had a presentation at the EFAO conference. And we've got lots of things planned for the next year to help get the word out about our project, and it'll be especially good once we get some results to get some media articles. And just a quick thanks to the partners and sponsors. Of course, thanks to Soil and Crop for having the project fund. But Mike Cobra, Sebastian Belliard are both going to be involved. Sarah Hargraves from EFAO, who helps to run their on-farm or farmer-led research program, is going to be involved, and she's very savvy with plot design and statistics. And then thanks to the sponsors, so we were really lucky to have some good sponsors donate seed this fall, and they are listed there. If there is time for maybe one or two questions.
Have you, or will you be able to quantify if the increase in the biomass from the late terminated rye will make up for a slight yield reduction?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that's something that we're probably all have to think through, and growers will have to think through on their own, whether it's the extra biomass that you get in the rye is going to be worth it in terms of if there is a slight yield hit. And so, I'm not too concerned about a bushel and a half, and there's no statistical difference there. But if we have situations where we're seeing 4.5 bushels, that's not a scenario that we want. So I think it's about finding ways to mitigate the risk, whether it's soybean seeding rates or planter setup, like mitigating the risk in the first place. And then that's a personal decision, I think, and hopefully it would be a break-even scenario.